thank you for joining us tonight for this special presentation, recognizing a compelling story, which has inspired the creativity of 3 Michigan women artists. My name is Jacqueline Thompson, and I'm the librarian here at the KIA. We are going to begin our evening with Betty Beeby, a Kalamazoo artist who, after discovering letters in a family barn, felt inspired to create a series of 9 lithographs depicting pivotal moments exchanged between estranged mother and son. We then moved to a tone poem and symphony, which was inspired by the lithographs and the story, which is composed by Lynn Palmer Warren, who's here tonight. And then finally, we're excited to show the 2011 ballet performed in Petoskey, Michigan, choreographed by Heather Rao, who has given permission for us to show it here tonight. I'd like to take a moment to thank the Ladies Library Association for collaborating on tonight's presentation and for providing the refreshments. Thank you. Following our question and answer session, you'll have the opportunity to view 3 of the lithographs in the front of the auditorium, which are here now. So, the story of the Petersboro Letters. The Petersboro Letters is a story within a story. Betty Beeby was the daughter of Dorothy Waite and Norton Pearl, or Ike, as he is referred to often throughout the letters. Norton was, Norton was Lauren Post's best friend. Their letters and diaries were discovered in a family barn located on Torch Lake, where the family had property for many years. Betty became invested in piecing together and telling the story of a long-held secret, sorting through 5,000 some letters. Lauren had been adopted as a baby, and many years after being told about his birth mother, had finally written to her in 1904. Beeby reached out to a family friend, journalist Larry Smith, who had experience in writing books, and began a collaboration where Betty Beeby's lithographs would be featured. Upon piecing together the story, Beeby couldn't help but visualize the mother's words and create the drawings of the pictures of which they inspired. She even traveled to Petersboro to see Minnie's house, which was still standing at the time. The Story of Hidden Hearts, which is what I'm going to talk about, was published in 2019. When Minnie Griffin gave birth to a baby boy in 1876, as an unwed single mother, the world was a harrowing place for her. The baby was surrendered to adoptive parents who tell Minnie that the baby had died 2 weeks later. Fast forward 27 years, Lauren Post, the baby born to Minnie Griffin, reaches out to his birth mother, writing her a letter addressed to Peterborough, Ontario, Canada, where she was residing. The letter was intercepted by her niece, Nina Petit, who becomes party to a secret. In the many years following this experience, Minnie closely guarded her past. Shocked and in consideration for her dear aunt, Nina takes it upon herself to write a response to Lauren, asking for more information and to evaluate if he really wants to explore a relationship with his birth mother. After some consideration and consultation with Norton, Lauren agrees and they devise a plan to tell Minnie about her son. Of course, Minnie is shocked at first, but expresses joy at being given the chance to know her son as a grown man. The book follows 12 months of correspondence, exchanging photos, and 1 documented visit from Lauren to Petersboro while he was on his way to the World's Fair. As letters from Minnie and Lauren are what mainly tell the story, gaps are supplemented by Lauren's diary entries and correspondence with other friends, providing a fuller depiction of who Lauren was and life during this time period. With care, I feel it would be appropriate to issue a content warning if you decide that you'd like to read this book. Letters and sentiments throughout depict a casual attitude of racism and sexism prevalent during the time period. Derogatory language is included in some of the letters from Lauren as well as others. I would like to talk a little bit about the lithographs that were the inspiration behind these letters. So we start with the first one. I just want to give a little bit of context about them. I'm not going to go into too much detail, and I will invite you at the end to come up and take a look at them in detail. The first one of the 9 is Party to a Secret, which is our cover photo. The lithographs were donated by the artist to the Kalamazoo Institute of Art, and an exhibition was created to display them upon their donation. The Kalamazoo Gazette accompanied the opening of that show, and I wanted to just read a little quote from that. Beeby never limits herself to mere detail. She is going from overall patterning to underall patterns to flourishes and flowers in between. For extras, she throws in mirror images, pasted on elements, and destroyed perspectives. And she makes this muchness work. Her prints read strongly from a distance. They're endlessly fascinating up close, and scrutiny with a hand lens yields more. So the Party to a Secret was the cover photo that was selected for the book. And you can see a lot of the symbolism, I think, with the letters, the stamps, the jacket. Minnie wrote a lot of letters back and forth to Lauren, so they, the hand there, I think, is very symbolic of that. Excuse me, I'm sorry. The second one, I wrote the name, that was the beginning of chapter 1. And this quote was taken from that section that says, "You must understand that a letter coming to her now after all these years would be a shock to which hardly any woman could stand." This was Nina's response to Lauren after she received his first letter, and her concern for how Minnie might feel receiving this kind of information after thinking that her son had died. She wrote the name Lauren on his little dress and had pinned it there, and 2 weeks later she was told that he had died, so it would be very shocking. What you say, that appears at the beginning of chapter 2, and the quote that follows is, "In doing so, I have unintentionally become a party to a secret, which it is quite evident was not intended for me to know." Again, this is Nina talking to Lauren about her concern for Minnie. But withal, chapter 3, I really think it would be best for me to speak to her because one never knows what harm a letter may do. Again, this was taken from Nina's letter to Lauren regarding her concern, and it was kind of prophetic. Minnie will, after her introduction to Lauren and meeting him, she will go on to experience some depression and anxiety. And I think that Nina's concern for that was kind of foreshadowing a little bit. The lights are playing. That was at the beginning of chapter 6. And the quote was, "The time will come where I will meet you. Sometimes I don't know how to do it, and it will take all the courage that I've got." And Minnie was very excited to be able to meet with Lauren, but expressing a lot of concern that it was going to be really hard for her. The lights are playing. That was at the beginning of chapter 6. I'm sorry, I just did that one. One Happy Week. That was one that we also have pulled for you to see. That was the only one with color that you can see kind of in the middle there. And it's very symbolic of the fact that that was the one week that Minnie and Lauren spent together that we have documented. They may have seen each other later on, but we only have this one section where he wrote in his diary about his experience of meeting with her. There's a picture in that chapter that accompanies his stay in Peterborough as well. He talks a lot about the weather and sightseeing and experiencing daily life. And then I just pulled this quote from the book because I thought it was really interesting. "And so 4 months short of 28 years from the day she gave birth to her illegitimate son, Minnie Griffin is reunited with him. It is at once fascinating and appalling to speculate on what a reaction she must have had on seeing Lauren. At that age, he may well have very much looked like the man who fathers him, a ghost stepping back into poor Minnie's world." Lauren's stay in Petersboro seems almost certain to have been the climax of her life. In all the diaries and letters that follow, there is no mention of the man that led Minnie astray. So this is a very big moment for her. I had a flashlight. This was a really meaningful lithograph as well because she makes an allusion to a picture that was taken while he was staying with her in Petersboro. And the quote is, "I had a flashlight in my room taken," which alludes to a photograph. "You can see your cap hanging on the looking glass at the end of the room. I am standing behind the chair." And it's really meaningful to her to know that she didn't imagine this meeting happening. Yeah, he was actually there, and there's proof of that. Forwarded is at the beginning of chapter 11, and this is where we see kind of Minnie's anxiety start to ramp up. Her letters are becoming more urgent to Lauren, asking him for more responses to make sure that he's okay. He's traveling a lot during this time too, which is why it's called Forwarded. And then the last one is, I guess I never knew, and that was at the beginning of chapter 12. And the quote is, I would rather have a letter from you than a diamond from anyone else. So she's really expressing how much she loved her time and her exchanges with him. So I would like to invite Sharon Carlson up to present a little bit of history on Betty Beeby.
So, who was Betty Beeby? Betty Jean Pearl Beeby was born March 26, 1923 in Detroit. Her parents were Dorothy Waite Pearl and Norton Pearl. Betty grew up in Detroit. She attended Cass Technical High School, where she credited a teacher, Mary Davis, as being instrumental in helping her become an artist. She spent her summers on the Pearl family farm in Eastport, Michigan, in Antrim County. During her senior year of high school, Betty submitted her portfolio and won the prestigious Booth Scholarship to New York's Pratt Institute. Her work was so good that she was actually admitted as a second-year student. And upon her graduation in 1940, she was hired by Time Life magazine. During her time at Time Life, she actually met another Michigander. She met James Beeby, and he had been born in Sparta, Michigan. He went to the University of Chicago, got a degree in pharmacy. He served during World War II. He was a PT on a PT boat. They were married in 1944, and Betty continued working until she was pregnant with their first child in 1945. In 1950, the Beebys moved to Kalamazoo, where James' work as a pharmacist brought them to the community. And there are varying accounts. I think he worked for, I've heard, Snow's Pharmacy, other pharmacies, but they would remain in Kalamazoo for the next couple of decades. And the last of the Beeby's 4 children, Josie or Josephine, would be born in Kalamazoo. And so during this time, the young family took up much of Betty's time, although she still continued to find time for her art. She was employed as an artist during this time. In interviews later in her life, whoops, I need to go back. I've spoiled it already. I gave away the best secret. So in interviews later in her life, she would talk about staying up late into the hours of the night so she could get her work done, after the kids had gone to bed. So she was employed as an artist. She published her first book, Just Josie, for preschoolers in 1960. It earned the Chicago Book Clinic Award for Excellence in the Bookmaking Arts. In 1966, she completed the illustrations for Whistle Up the Bay, and in 1968, The Silver Trumpet. She was the illustrator of 14 children's books, several college textbooks. She worked for a while during her time in Kalamazoo at the Sequoia Press, and there she did work. They had assignments for Kellogg, Gerber Baby Foods. She also illustrated a series of 27 books. They were children's Bible stories. It was published by the Contemporary Writers and Christian Perspective Company, but this was done under, I think, the auspices of the Sequoia Press. In 1974, Betty moved to Eastport, Michigan, and was commissioned to paint a 50-foot mural at Fort Michilimackinac Visitor Center, and this is that part of that mural that's there. And she passed away in 2015. When Betty moved to Kalamazoo in 1950, it was a homecoming of sorts. Betty's mother, Dorothy Waite Pearl, had actually been born and grown up in Kalamazoo, and her mother was part of the early pioneering Waite and Fitch families. So she was coming back. I'm sure she probably spent time in Kalamazoo visiting family as she was growing up. So as I mentioned, one of Betty's best-known public art installations is this mural that's, at the Visitor Center. And the other piece that I think most people in Kalamazoo associate with Betty is this piece right here. If you lived in Kalamazoo anytime in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, remnants of this frog are still there. The family moved to a house at 3614 Lovers Lane. So if you've ever driven by the frog on Lovers Lane, when I was a kid, we'd go to Millen Park and my mother would say, look at the frog. It was not a commissioned piece of art, but it was probably, something that thousands, if not tens of thousands of people have seen in the last 60 years in this community. Betty's children recalled that she painted the frog in 1954. The home remained in the family until 2015. And I had the good fortune, I met Betty several times. I met extended family members because Betty's papers and papers of her extended family are actually housed. I know there are materials here at the KIA, but the family papers, a number of them are at Western's archives. And in 1963, Alan Brown, who was a professor of history and Western's first archivist, began a correspondence with Dorothy Waite Pearl, Betty's mother. Reading between the lines and looking at some of the documentation, I think Betty had made the acquaintance of Alan Brown. I think she was visiting the archives. At that point, it would have been in the old Waldo Library. And the archives now is, of course, part of the Zane Legacy Collection Center. And at this point, Betty's mother, Dorothy Waite Pearl, was splitting her time between Washington, D.C. and Eastport, Michigan. So as she talked about, the family, the papers, Alan Brown was definitely interested. A little bit about about Betty's parents. Dorothy Waite Pearl was born in 1896 to Benjamin and Nellie Waite in a farmhouse in Kalamazoo County. And as I mentioned, descended from an early Kalamazoo pioneer family, the Waites and the Fitches. I've always loved, and I think it's clear, I think you can see Preserved S. Waite. That would have been Dorothy's grandfather, and it was Betty's great-grandfather. Preserved Salisbury Waite. That's a name, I've seen it for years, and I love the name. But in any case, Preserved Waite had a farm in Kalamazoo County, just to the south and west of what is today Western's campus. And the map to the right is an 1890 plat map. And you might be able to tell the reference in the upper right-hand corner. It's the Michigan Asylum for the Insane. It's the state hospital. That kind of, that's actually Howard Street, or there's Avenue, which is current day Stadium Drive, and Howard Street, and Oakland Drive, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is Asylum Avenue or Oakland Drive, Howard Street, and this is the Preserved S. Waite family farmstead. So this is a little bit about the family. Betty's parents were extraordinary people in their own right. Her mother, Dorothy, had graduated from Western State Normal in 1918. She taught school in Kalamazoo and Detroit. While living in Detroit, she met her future husband, Norton Pearl. Dorothy would go on to serve as national president of the American Legion Auxiliary in 1946 and 47. She actually received an honor from the government of France for her work with World War I orphans. And Betty's father, Norton Pearl, he's the connection to Antrim County. But before he met and married Dorothy, he actually had served as one of the first park rangers in Glacier National Park. But after he got, I guess, that out of his system, he had settled in Detroit. He served as a principal in the Detroit schools and was appointed as supervisor of health education department in Detroit. So I felt like I had to tell you a little bit about Betty's parents, whose papers are now part of the collection. In the early 1960s, Dr. Brown of Western, though, he was far more interested in the Waite family materials because of their connection with early Kalamazoo County. And to give you a sense of probably what Dr. Brown, saw when Betty walked in to the archives, Waite Avenue, it's near the property, so that is named for the family. And here's a little piece of trivia. The Waites had a horse named Benjamin. And they used to take that horse and they'd visit the Waite family a little ways away. There's a story, I know Waite is named for the Waite family, and I have heard numerous references to Benjamin being named for the Waite family horse. So anyway, the initial donation was made in 1964, and at that point only included 51 letters. As Betty discovered more and more materials as she made frequent trips to Eastport, these materials came in. Eventually, Betty's own papers, the papers of her father, Norton Pearl, and it's a fairly large collection. It's been consulted a number of times. After James retired, Betty and James moved to Eastport, and that's where, of course, she discovered those Petersboro Letters in that barn in Eastport, Michigan. We know that Lauren Post was a friend of Norton Pearl's, and that's presumably how the letters came to be stored in that family barn. and the basis for the Hidden Hearts and the ballet. So that's just a little bit about Betty and her life in Kalamazoo and her contributions as an artist and the connection to the greater Kalamazoo community. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karen Whitworth, who will introduce the next phase of the program.
Hi, I'm Karen Woodworth from the Ladies Library Association, and yes, it's my privilege to introduce our second artist this evening. Lynn Palmer Warren is a Michigan native who grew up in the Lansing area. Somewhere there still exists an audio tape of her at 3 years old singing the theme songs of her favorite TV shows perfectly in tune. And when she couldn't remember the end of a song, she'd just make up her own very dramatic, elaborate, and loud endings. She says she's been making it up as she goes along ever since. She fell in love with the piano at an early age and eventually earned a master's degree in applied piano from Michigan State University. After she graduated, she performed in pop and rock bands for a few years in the mid-Michigan area, including at a bowling alley here in Kalamazoo, and then moved to Los Angeles to study film composition with Don Ray. She scored a couple of very minor films, which she says you will never see, but that found that her composing interest lay more in writing concert and sacred music. While she was living in LA, she and some fellow composers founded Pacific Composers Forum, a nonprofit organization which put on concerts of original music, held composition contests, and offered classes. Over the years, Lynn has been commissioned to write for solo voice, choir, band, and orchestra, as well as for musical theater. This year, she recorded and released an album of original sacred solos for voice and piano with baritone Logan Delacqua. In addition to composing, she has an extensive career as a collaborative pianist, a church organist, and as an occasional music director for theater productions. Lynn and her son Christopher currently live in Traverse City, where she works as a pianist for the Traverse City Area Public Schools and the Interlochen Summer Music Program, and as organist for First Church of Christ Scientist. Please join me in welcoming Lynn Palmer Warren.
Good evening. It's such a pleasure to be here to share in this celebration of the power of a mother's love, so beautifully expressed in Minnie's letters that it is still touching people 120 years later. For me, all this began while I was still living in Los Angeles, had come to visit my folks in Michigan, and drove up north to Eastport to see my longtime friend Liz Evans, the daughter of Betty Beeby's twin sister. Liz owns a cabin up there that's just a few houses over from where Betty stayed during the summers. One evening, we walked over to visit Betty and see her new artwork, a series of lithographs based on letters from Petersboro. They were tacked to the walls of her house, the inside of her house, with copies of the letters underneath that accompanied each lithograph, that inspired each lithograph. And after studying all of them, I said to Betty, these are music. And knowing that I was a musician and composer, she invited me to write something for them. So about a year and a half later, the first edition of the Petersboro Letters, a trio for flute, violin, and harp, premiered in Los Angeles under the auspices of the Pacific Composers Forum. The next year, I expanded the instrumentation to a septet, which was performed at the Will Rogers Auditorium by members of the Los Angeles Philharmonic. Following that were 2 concerts in northern Michigan at the Northwoods Festival. And some years later, the Great Lakes Chamber Orchestra in Petoskey asked me to expand the instrumentation again to include a full string section for a multimedia performance, which included slide projections of the lithographs, along with a reading of excerpts from the letters. Another few years went by, and the Great Lakes Chamber Orchestra notified me of their wish to collaborate with choreographer Heather Rao of the Crooked Tree Arts Center in creating a ballet version of the Petersboro Letters. This is what you'll be seeing tonight. In 2014, I had the pleasure of attending a multimedia orchestral version performed in Peterborough, England on Mother's Day. So before you see the ballet, I'm going to verbally walk you through the music to give you a mind's eye view of what I was thinking when I wrote it, and so you can kind of follow along. To begin with, I found that writing music is not so much a matter of invention as it is discovery. There's always an idea, a concept, or a story behind it which generates it and shapes it. Each piece I've found is in a sense already fully formed on its own merits, and my job is to reveal it. Like sculpting, it may require scraping away material that doesn't belong. Like novel writing, it often goes places I don't expect, and if I try to control it intellectually, it stops dead in the water. In the case of the Petersboro Letters, the letters and artwork which inspired the music were so rich that a lot of the music just poured out. This is a programmatic work, which you might call a tone poem, which follows the story of Minnie, her year-long reunion with her long-lost son Lauren, and their subsequent parting. Now, at the time that I wrote this, Betty's researchers were not able to uncover any relationship between them beyond the year of letters. So for all we knew, she just disappeared. And we didn't know that she ever found him again, or he ever found her again. And so this piece represents that version, I guess you would say, of the story. Throughout the piece, Nellie is represented by the violin. Nellie, I call her Nellie. She was Nellie. Betty called her Nellie first. Her real name was Minnie, so I keep thinking Nellie. Minnie is represented by the violin and Lauren by the cello, each with its own musical theme. There are 5 connected movements which represent different stages in their lives. The opening movement, entitled Birth, features Minnie's theme. In the introduction, you'll hear 3 instances of the violin playing a tidbit of the theme, in which the last note is taken over by the cello, kind of like the growth of the baby in the womb. Then Minnie's theme is presented in full. The second movement, Rite of Passage, presents Lauren's theme, a robust melody in the cello section that expresses his wanderlust and adventuring spirit. At various points, you will hear the cello play the opening notes of Minnie's theme as he searches for his birth mother. The third movement is a soliloquy for solo violin and expresses Minnie's combined shock and joy upon first hearing from the son she thought had died as a baby. The fourth and longest movement, Reunion, depicts scenes from Lauren's visit to his mother in Peterborough, Canada. Following an anticipatory opening section describing in musical terms how Minnie waited for every train for his arrival, her theme reappears as a duet between the violin and cello, often shared as call and response. The reunion includes a dance and a lullaby that echoes Minnie's memories of watching him sleep, and one of the lithographs depicts her kind of remembering that. Then Lauren's theme is reintroduced, and the 2 themes begin to diverge until after one last passionate burst in the violin, the mother's theme dies out, and the belated calls from the cello meet no response, reflecting Minnie's disappearance from Lauren's life. In the last movement, Epilogue, A new theme, warm and bittersweet, appears in the flute. The theme is repeated by the strings in 3 parts, no first violin, and then one last time by solo cello. This was the most difficult part of the work to write. I was having trouble figuring out how to end the piece, and finally I just sat down on the piano and improvised this 10-measure little ditty in 3 voices that didn't seem to relate to anything else. It wasn't until I wrote it out and really looked at it that I discovered that the melody was in the middle voice and that it grew out of the cello's call at the end of the previous movement. It came to represent for me the change in both in Minnie and Lauren that would have come from finding and getting to know each other, a certain widening of the heart, perhaps. So I sent choreographer Heather Rao a similar explanation as I've just given you, and the resulting ballet follows the main outlines of it, but it is definitely Heather's take on the story and the music. One of the beauties of music is that once it leaves the hands of the composer, it becomes, in a way, the property of the conductor, the instrumentalists, the choreographer, dancers, each of whom bring their own talents, skills, and individuality to create their own unique performances. Each may interpret the music a little differently, but all are still authentic and legitimate. And so I guess now it's time to see the ballet.